Hi folks, welcome back to GlobalBake. Today we're going to talk about some recipe basics. So let's just jump right in. Recipes are located on the products menu under recipes. When I open this, I get my lookup window that shows me all the recipes in the system. And what you might notice is that there's a color coding to the recipes. Any recipe that is a blank white line is a recipe that is not making a product. Any recipe that has a colored line is a recipe that is actually making a product. If I right click and hold the button down, we see what the colors mean. Green is recipes that make finished products, yellow is recipes that make ingredients, and the bluish one is they make a product in process. More about those in a minute. So let's take a look at a basic dough recipe for fiber dough, fiber white dough. So we're going to want a yellow one, right? So let's see here. Where did it go? If I know what it's called, I can just type in the recipe code number and go immediately to it, but it's right here under white dough mix. So I can either double click or hit display or Alt D or hit enter. I'll just hit display. They all do the same thing. So here's the recipe screen. Up here at the top we see recipe, which is the data class we're working with. We're in the recipe data. And inquire change. This is a screen where we can edit the recipe that exists. If we were in an add screen, all the fields would be blank and this would say recipe add. The first field is the recipe code. Now this is something that needs to be unique in the recipe, and I recommend that people create a nomenclature or a naming system that makes sense to them, that reflects their processes and their organization well, so that when you look at something in the system, you know that's a recipe code, that's a product code, that's a this, that's a that. So it becomes much more intuitive and easier to navigate the system. An order key is a way for you to override the natural bake type category system for how things come out in the production sheets and things like that. It isn't used by everyone, but it is handy in certain situations. Description is the description of what this particular recipe is. A recipe is a process in GlobalBake, so it represents the act of putting all these things into the mixer and turning the mixer on. The actual thing we get out of the recipe when we turn the mixer off, the ball of dough, that is a product, a result of the recipe. And it is that product that we link this recipe to so that we can use in the next step or in another recipe, potentially. Okay, batch units are the particular units of measure that we're going to use for this recipe. We're going to do pounds here. Yield is the weight of the batch that we're going to be doing here. Scale F weight is grayed out because our batch units are pound, which is our system default weight unit in our demonstration system here. So the scale weight is not needed because our pounds equal pounds, right? We're not converting into an each or something else like that. Bake type is a category for recipes, and we can have as many as you need. Your production reporting is always organized by bake type, so it's important to have a consideration about what we want them to be. Mostly your bake type is a concept I like to refer people to think of it as a work center within their production facility. So you may have a packing station, and you may have a mixing station and a shaping station if you're making bread. And maybe those are three different bake types that need three different kinds of information or three different steps in your process. Okay, you may have different doughs that get mixed together for like a pumpernickel rye or something like that. That could all be part of the dough or the mixing set, or maybe it's part of the shaping set, depending on how you categorize things and who you want that information to go to, right, in terms of your production facility. In this particular case, we're in the dough category, so I just have all my dough recipes in my demo system here running into the dough bake type. Okay, the bake type is required. You cannot save the recipe without it, as is the recipe code and the yield entry. Everything else can actually be left blank, although it's in your profound best interest to fill these things out so you know what it is you're working with. The department is not required technically. It is a good idea to populate it because when you start working with the other end of your production, confirmation, telling the system what you've actually done for the day, that's going to be organized by department usually. So it's a good thing. Your department information is more like a cost center So you might have a manufacturing department that basically covers all the aspects of manufacturing, and maybe you have a wrapping department because your packagers don't make the same as your production guys. So you can separate that out, and you can start apportioning out an idea of what the labor cost might be in terms of number of man minutes to produce this or that product or this step, right? So we can talk more about costing later, but essentially I have this in the manufacturing department. If I display this department, what I see is it's a $14 an hour. They're the day shifts. There's 3 guys. They work 9 hours, and that's 1,620 minutes at $14 an hour. And if you're running multiple departments in your GL, you can have this work with this, and there are some interesting options here, but we're just going to leave it the way it is. Other things to consider about your recipe up here in the header portion are the batch units. Certain recipe reporting will take notice of this. So when your production reporting comes out, it'll tell you, hey, I need 3 batches of my maximum batch and 1 of my minimum batch in order to fulfill my yield, what I need for today. My requirement might be 1,500 pounds of dough, and it'll break it out based on these numbers. If you leave these blank, the system will just tell you the total amount of dough you need and tell you how much of each ingredient you need. Different people like it different ways. So you have minimum batch units, maximum batch units, and a batch increment. The batch increment would say, I want new batch sizes for every 50 pounds or 100 pounds. And people do this different ways based on, sometimes they base their recipes on number of bags of flour. And so they base their batch increments on flour bags. So maybe it's 100-pound increments or something like that, depending. Or you can leave it blank and the system just tell you, hey, go make 1,500 pounds of dough and your guys work it out on the floor. A lot of people like to do it that way because they like to manage that particular detail on the floor because things change. Equal batches is a way for you to make the system take that 1,500 pound and force it into the equal number of batches. If my batches are 147.89 pounds, it would automatically force it into a bunch of batch sizes that are all the same size. Not everyone uses that. It's not a popular thing, but it is there because someone wanted it. The next section here where it says fixed and variable man minutes. This is where we can start apportioning the labor interest from the department. Right? We said $14 an hour, and this is 5 minutes for fixed and 10 minutes for variable, and that's where this $3.50 labor charge is coming from over here. Fixed man minutes, if I hover, it doesn't really tell us much other than it's fixed man minutes, but what this means is this is like a setup time for this recipe. So maybe it takes 5 minutes of work to get all the ingredients set up, get the machine configured, and get everything in the bowl and turn the mixer on. The variable man minutes, right, this is how long it actually takes this recipe process to run. So maybe it's a 10-minute mix cycle. Okay. Now this is a labor situation. It may be that it takes 10 minutes to run, but maybe the guy doesn't watch it all 10 minutes. Maybe the actual labor coefficient is less. But the important differentiation to understand here is the fixed man minutes. If I need to run this recipe 10 times to make my 1,000 pounds of dough or 1,500 pounds of dough or whatever, I do this setup once. I get all my ingredients and everything all together. That gets hit the first time that we run this recipe. The variable hits every time I run the recipe. So that first recipe will have 15 minutes of labor on it. All the other ones will have 10. So in terms of what you're looking at when you get into planning, you can start looking at expected run times, and you can have an idea of how many man minutes you might be needing to use today and needing to have available today to plan your production. As always, it's kind of a moving target with these things, so it can give you some information, and typically the information you put here is information that you collect over time and sort of drill down and carve out and say, this is a pretty good way for me to budget this particular aspect of the system. And that's what it's intended for. It does add into your costing, and that's important. These bits down here in the bottom, we have the these tabs: ingredients, notes, production, and nutrition. Ingredients are just that, the ingredients that go into this particular recipe. And here we have flour, yeast, salt, water, milk powder, sugar, and white dough starter, which is a previously made product. So these are the quantities, the units, the weights, the pounds. And I usually set my recipe up to look this way. You can add and remove columns from the recipe fields by right-clicking on the header and going to insert or delete if you don't want something. I like this setup because it'll immediately let me know if I have a problem with the configuration of one of my ingredients. My quantity is 91 pounds, the weight is 91 pounds, so my ingredient weight is set up properly. My line cost is this much. If my cost is really, really wacky, say it said $15,000 or something like that, I would know I have a problem with my ingredient somewhere and I would need to go and investigate. Okay. Notes are production notes that you can send internally that don't appear on the production plan. They're just notes about this recipe that appear on this screen. Here is a way to put a picture in. If I wanted to put a picture of this process in here, I could double click and load a file into the database and it would appear when I go here. The production tab is the production notes here. These appear on many of the production reports. A lot of times the recipe instructions are here, grab these ingredients, mix them this way, turn on the mixer for this long, check this way, and that'll appear out on the production reports if that report uses it. Nutrition is some particular nutrition information you can put in here, shelf lives, directions, allergens, different information can be controlled here. Not all of it shows up on reports. It's mostly for your internal management. But it is useful information to have. Now, that's the recipe in general. Up here in the top, we have overheads and quantities and costings and production report. Now with production report, you can specify that you do not want this to print if it's just a recipe that's maybe converting units and it doesn't need to show up on production reports. Perhaps it would be confusing to people if it did. You can do that. You can set a blank page before or break after if you need a notes page to come out with it to make sure that the next recipe in the list always comes out correctly or something like that. The overheads, you have a percentage ratio and a leverage ratio here. The percentage is set up in the company details and you can decide whether that's going to be a percent of ingredient cost, a percent of labor cost, and a percent of ingredient and labor cost. It could be $1 per unit, it could be $1 per weight unit. I do believe our demo is set up for a percent of ingredient and labor cost. So I take 10% of my overall ingredient and labor cost and I apply that as an overhead cost here. Now my leverage ratio is 0.5. So I've set this up at about half the normal. Say 1 would be a normal overhead cost. So maybe this doesn't take as much overhead as my average recipe. So I say it at 0.5, and these are also, like the labor numbers, these are numbers that you sort of carve into over time and get closer and closer to have a better idea as you go on. Most of the time you have a loose idea of what this leverage ratio might be, but you get better information over time as you work with it more and more. So that's where this overhead $3.25 and a quarter cent comes from right here. It's this. So now that's great. Now that's everything on the recipe. Now the bits beyond the recipe is the most important question, right? Is how do I use this recipe in my next product? Because I just don't make just dough. I make a shaped product out of my dough, right? So the recipe is the process. So this is everything in the mixer, and we turn the mixer on. The mixer runs for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we have a big ball of dough, and we turn the mixer off, and we scrape that out or whatever, and we put it in a bowl. It goes on to the next process. Maybe it goes into a shaping machine, maybe it goes into a hand shaping station, right? But it goes into the next process. If I look at the details button here, I look on the product made category, and I can just double click this, and I open this up. And this is a made up ingredient, right? A MUI, M-U-I. And this is something we make as part of our production process, but it isn't a sellable product. Only finished products can be placed on orders. Now, if we sell dough, we can link this out to a finished product as a dough and sell dough. But this particular product is an intermediary step, right? Our item code is D100. In this particular case, it matches our recipe. Some people like that, some people don't. It could be renamed differently. A lot of times I'll put like an MUI before or after it so that I know that it's a MUI when I look at it. It's about that nomenclature naming function that we talked about earlier. It has a description, it has the units. It has a group. All products have to have a group. Here's the recipe code that makes it. And the bake units is a concept of how many times I execute the recipe to get one of this. Okay, and this is the product that goes into the ingredient line on the next recipe. And we'll talk about chaining up on the next video. Hope this was helpful. Have a great day.